There is a specific kind of pain that has no name in most languages, and almost no one will tell you the truth about it. The moment you start becoming yourself, the room gets emptier. Not because you did something wrong. Because you stopped doing something wrong, you stopped shrinking. And the people who loved the smaller version of you don't always know how to love this one. Carl Jung spent his entire life studying this exact wound, and what he found will either terrify you or set you free, depending on whether you're ready to hear it. Stay with me for the next 30 minutes, because by the end, the isolation you've been running from is going to look like something else entirely. Part 1, the quiet departure here, is something almost nobody says out loud. Belonging has a price, and most of us pay it without ever reading the invoice. We learn, from the earliest years of life, that safety comes from matching. Matching the family's moods, matching the classroom's rules, matching the unspoken code of whatever group agreed to keep us. Carl Jung, writing from his practice in Zurich in the early decades of the 20th century, called this matching a kind of psychological camouflage, a costume built so early and worn so constantly that most people forget it was ever a costume at all. But costumes are built for a body that stops growing. And people don't stop growing. There comes a season sometimes triggered by a loss, sometimes by a milestone birthday, sometimes by nothing you can point to at all, where the costume starts to pull at the seams. You go to the same gathering you've gone to for 15 years, and something has shifted. The jokes land differently. The conversations that used to feel like home now feel like a rerun you've already seen twice. You're not imagining it. You haven't become cynical, or ungrateful, or broken. You've simply outgrown the shape you were wearing. Consider a composite figure, call her a woman in her early 60s, recently retired from 4 decades in a school system she loved. For the first few months, retirement felt like a long-awaited exhale. Then came the 3rd month, when the calls from old colleagues thinned out, and she found herself standing in her kitchen at 10 in the morning with no bell to answer, no hallway to walk, and most disorienting of all, no clear sense of who she was without the role. She wasn't sad exactly. She was disoriented in a way retirement brochures never mention. That disorientation is the first fingerprint of what Jung called individuation, the lifelong process of becoming a complete, undivided self, distinct from the roles the world assigned you. Here's the question worth sitting with. What if the ache you're feeling right now isn't a sign that something is going wrong in your life, but the first evidence that something is finally going right? Jung didn't discover this process by watching other people from a comfortable distance. He lived through his own catastrophic version of it. After his break with Sigmund Freud in 1913, a rupture that cost him his professional community, his mentor, and much of his public reputation, Jung entered what he later called his confrontation with the unconscious. Years of intense inner turbulence, during which he kept almost no public lectures and lost most of his former circle. He was, by his own account, professionally and socially alone. And it was precisely inside that isolation that the ideas which would define analytical psychology were born. He didn't individuate in a lecture hall. He individuated in the wreckage of his old belonging. This is the pattern he later mapped for the rest of us. The outgrowing always comes before the arrival. There is no version of becoming whole that skips the empty room. Jung gave the costume itself a formal name, the persona. Borrowed from the Latin word for a theatrical mask, the persona is the face you present to the world, polite, competent, appropriate to the room you're standing in. He didn't consider the persona a lie, exactly. He considered it necessary, even useful. a kind of social lubricant that lets a household function and a workplace run smoothly. The trouble starts, he warned, when a person forgets the mask is a mask, when the persona becomes mistaken for the whole self, and everything outside its narrow requirements gets quietly disowned. Think about how many decades most people spend perfecting a single mask. The responsible one, the easygoing one, the one who never causes trouble. It works beautifully right up until the moment life removes the stage the mask was built for. Retirement removes the professional mask. An empty nest removes the caretaking mask. A death removes the partnership mask, and suddenly you're standing in the wings of your own life, holding a mask that no longer has a role to attach itself to, wondering who exactly is underneath it. Consider a second composite figure. Call him a man in his late 60s, a former regional sales director who spent 38 years being, by every account, remarkably good at his job. Colleagues described him as steady, sharp, the person you wanted in the room when a deal was falling apart. 6 months into retirement, his wife noticed he had started reorganizing the garage for the third time that year, not out of any real need, but because activity of any kind felt safer than the silence of not knowing who's steady, sharp. The guy who fixes things was supposed to be when there was no longer a deal to fix. He wasn't lazy or purposeless. He was, without knowing the term for it, staring directly at his own persona for the first time in 4 decades, and finding it strangely unfamiliar without an audience. This is worth naming plainly. The discomfort of that moment is not a design flaw in your life. It is the exact mechanism Jung described as the necessary first crack the mask loosening just enough to let you notice, for the first time in years, that there was ever a face underneath it at all. Part 2, the middle country. If the first stage is departure, the second stage is the part almost nobody prepares you for, because it doesn't look like progress. It looks like nothing. Jung described a psychic terrain that exists after you've left the old identity, but before the new one has solidified enough to stand on its own. Later thinkers gave this in-between zone various names. Liminal space is the phrase most people know today, but Jung's own language was more clinical and, in some ways, more honest. He called it a state of suspended orientation, where the ego has lost its old mirrors and hasn't yet built new ones. Picture a composite man, early 70s, recently widowed after a marriage that spanned nearly 5 decades. For years, his sense of a good day was defined entirely by their shared rituals, the same coffee order, the same walk, the same running commentary on the neighborhood. When she was gone, so was the mirror that had been reflecting his identity back to him for most of his adult life. He wasn't just grieving her. He was grieving the version of himself that only existed in relation to her. That second grief is rarely spoken about, and it is arguably the harder one. This is the middle country. Technologically, you may be more connected than any generation before you, a phone full of contacts, a feed full of family photos, and still feel like you are shouting across a canyon. Digital nearness was never designed to replace psychic nearness. You can have 400 connections and 0 mirrors. Why does silence feel so much louder in this stage than in ordinary loneliness? Because, Jung would argue, this isn't ordinary loneliness at all. Ordinary loneliness wants company. This kind of silence is doing something stranger. It's clearing space. Every external voice you're used to consulting, the old friend group, the familiar role, the reliable routine, has gone quiet. And in that quiet, a different voice has room to finally speak. Jung called it the voice of the self, as distinct from the ego, not the part of you built to be liked, but the part of you built to be true. Most people, standing in this middle country, do one of two things. They either sprint backward toward the old costume, forcing themselves back into gatherings and roles that no longer fit, just to make the discomfort stop, or they sit with the discomfort long enough to notice that underneath it, something patient is waiting. Something that was never granted permission to speak, while the old identity was running the show. Here's the cliffhanger worth carrying into the next section. That patient voice has a demand, and the demand is going to cost you something you've spent your entire life protecting. There's a reason this middle country feels so uniquely destabilizing, and it has to do with another piece of Jung's architecture, what he called the collective unconscious, the layer of the psyche that isn't personal at all, but shared, inherited, running underneath every culture's stories, symbols, and rites of passage. Nearly every human tradition Jung studied included some version of a threshold ritual, a period of removal from the group, a wilderness, a vigil, a fast, before a person was permitted to return in a new status, the 40 days in the desert, the vision quest, the isolation hut before initiation. He didn't think this was a coincidence dreamed up independently by unconnected cultures. He thought it reflected something structural about how a psyche actually transforms. It cannot be rushed, and it cannot happen in a crowd. What that means practically is almost comforting once you hear it. The empty, directionless feeling of the middle country isn't a modern malfunction unique to you. It's the same threshold every serious tradition on record has required before a genuine change in identity was considered real. The difference is that most of those traditions gave people a ritual container for it, an elder, a ceremony, a community that understood what the isolation was for. Most people today go through the identical psychological process with none of that scaffolding, alone in a kitchen or a garage, wondering if something has gone wrong with them specifically. Consider a composite figure, a woman in her late 50s whose youngest child had just left for college the same year her mother passed away. Two losses arriving within 4 months of each other. She described the following year not as sad, exactly, but as strangely weightless, as though the ropes that had tethered her to a specific daily identity had all been cut simultaneously, and she was drifting without quite falling. Nothing about her outer circumstances looked like a crisis. She still had her health, her marriage, her home, but internally, she was standing precisely in Jung's middle country, unmoored from the roles that had defined 3 decades of her life, and not yet anchored to whatever came next. This is exactly the point where most people make their first real mistake, and it's worth naming clearly before we move forward. They try to solve the disorientation by adding more noise. A new hobby picked up frantically, a calendar refilled just to feel busy again. There's nothing wrong with new hobbies, but if they're chosen to drown out the quiet rather than to genuinely explore what's next, they only delay the very process the quiet was trying to start. Part 3, the furnace. Jung made a distinction that changes everything if you actually absorb it. There is a canyon of difference between loneliness and solitude, even though from the outside they can look identical. Loneliness is an ache for company that isn't there. Solitude, in Jung's framework, is a chosen condition deliberately turning inward, on purpose, to do work that cannot be done in a crowd. The tragedy of most human suffering, in his view, is that people experience solitude's raw material, the isolation, the quiet, the exile, but interpret it entirely through loneliness's lens. And so they miss what the isolation was actually offering them. Think of it this way. A piece of ore doesn't choose to end up in a furnace, but once it's there, Something happens to it that could never happen anywhere else. The heat doesn't punish the ore. It separates the ore from the rock around it, burning away everything that was never truly metal to begin with. Being misunderstood functions the same way on the psyche. When the people around you stop reflecting you accurately, when your growth outpaces their picture of you, the natural response is to turn outward and demand they update the picture. But Jung's model suggests the more transformative move is the opposite. Let the misunderstanding push the energy inward instead of outward. Every ounce of psychic force you would have spent trying to be understood becomes, instead, fuel for building the thing that needed no external permission to exist in the first place. Consider a composite figure, a man in his late 50s, a lifelong volunteer at his church, suddenly finding himself questioning beliefs he had organized 4 decades of Sunday mornings around. His community sensed the shift before he had words for it, and the invitations grew quieter, the conversations more careful. For a long stretch, he interpreted this as failure, a man losing his place. It was only years later, in the reflection of hindsight, that he recognized what had actually happened. The friction of being misunderstood had forced him to stop outsourcing his convictions to a group and start actually building them himself, brick by brick, for the first time in his adult life. This is what Jung meant when he wrote about the transformative function of suffering, not suffering as punishment, but suffering as pressure, and pressure as the only force capable of turning carbon into something that can cut glass. Here's a question worth asking yourself right now, mid-video, before you keep scrolling to the next thing. What part of you has been waiting quietly, patiently, maybe for years, for enough solitude to finally get built? Because the furnace only works if you stay in it long enough. Leave too early, chasing the comfort of the old crowd, and the ore never separates from the rock. And that's exactly where most people get stuck, not because the process failed them, but because they walked out of the furnace 1 degree before the separation was complete. Jung's own furnace years produced something extraordinary and, for a long time, hidden from the public. A private journal of visions, dreams, and imagined dialogues that he kept almost entirely to himself, later known to the world as the Red Book. He filled it during the very years his professional community had gone quiet around him, when former colleagues crossed the street rather than acknowledge him at conferences. He wasn't producing it for an audience. He had, in the most literal sense, no audience left to produce it for. And it was precisely that absence of an audience that allowed him to build something honest, rather than performative, the raw material for nearly every concept. From the shadow to the self, that would eventually reshape 20th century psychology. There's a lesson in that sequence worth sitting with. The work that actually changes a life rarely gets built while people are watching. It gets built in the exact stretch of isolation most of us are desperately trying to escape. Every hour spent trying to convince an old audience to understand you again is an hour not spent building the thing that never needed their understanding in the first place. Consider a composite figure, a man in his early 60s, a retired contractor who had spent his entire working identity being the reliable one his extended family called whenever something broke. After a health scare limited his physical work, he found himself with no role left to perform for the people who had always defined him by his usefulness. For the first several months, the silence felt like an accusation, proof that without something to fix, he had nothing to offer. It was only in that uncomfortable stillness that he began, almost by accident, sketching furniture designs he'd sat on for 30 years, convinced they were a foolish hobby, unworthy of his attention. The furnace hadn't punished his uselessness. It had simply waited until the old identity burned away enough for the actual talent underneath to have room to breathe. Ask yourself, honestly, In this exact moment, what have you quietly labeled a foolish hobby that might, under different pressure, reveal itself as the very thing the isolation was clearing space for? Part 4, The Shadow and the Exile. No honest account of this journey can skip the ugly part. So, let's not skip it. When your evolution outpaces the group that raised you, something darker than sadness often shows up. Resentment, a bitterness that says, quietly, at 3 in the morning, why didn't they come with me? Why didn't they see what I was becoming sooner? Why do I have to be the one who changes while everyone else gets to stay comfortable? Jung had a name for the parts of ourselves we don't want to look at directly: the shadow. And here's the part that catches most people off guard: resentment toward the group you outgrew is itself shadow material, worth examining rather than simply indulging. It's tempting to wear the bitterness like a badge, proof of how far you've come. But Jung would push back on that comfort. Unexamined resentment doesn't liberate you from the old collective. It quietly binds you to it. Just from the opposite direction, you're still organizing your identity around them, only now through anger instead of approval. Picture a composite woman in her mid-60s, estranged for 2 years from a sister who couldn't understand her decision to leave a decades-long marriage that looked, from the outside, entirely fine. For a long time, she narrated the estrangement as her sister's failure to grow. It took an uncomfortable season of honest reflection to notice a second layer underneath the first. She had also, quietly, wanted her sister's approval badly enough that its absence had curdled into contempt. Naming that didn't excuse her sister's judgment, but it freed her from needing the judgment to stop in order to feel whole. There is a genuine and unresolved tension here, and Jung never pretended otherwise. The demand for psychic integrity, for living in alignment with what you now know to be true, will sometimes directly conflict with the human need for intimacy and closeness. You cannot always have both the whole truth and the whole tribe. Jung's honest answer wasn't a trick to make the tension disappear. It was to hold both needs consciously, rather than pretending only one of them is real. And here's what almost nobody tells you about this stage: the very traits that got you labeled as the difficult one, the different one, the one who changed those, are frequently the exact traits you buried decades earlier to be accepted in the first place. The misfit label isn't a wound to be healed away. Held consciously, it can become a map back to talents you shelved before you were even old enough to know you were shelving them. What happens next depends entirely on whether you can survive the accusation of being difficult long enough to find out what was underneath it. There's a second, quieter shadow worth naming here. One Jung linked to the disowned qualities a person suppresses simply because they didn't fit the role assigned to them early in life. A man raised to believe stoicism was strength may have buried an entire capacity for open tenderness decades ago, simply to survive the room he grew up in. A woman raised to believe agreeableness was safety may have buried a decisive, even combative side of herself before she was 10 years old. Individuation in Jung's model doesn't ask you to become someone new. It asks you to go back for the parts of yourself you left behind in order to be accepted, and to finally let them back into the room. Consider a composite figure, a woman in her early 70s, widely known in her family as endlessly accommodating, the one who kept the peace at every holiday gathering for 50 years. In the 2 years following her husband's death, something unexpected surfaced. A blunt, occasionally sharp-edged honesty she had suppressed since childhood. When speaking her mind had reliably cost her her mother's approval. Her adult children found the change unsettling at first, describing her as different in a tone that wasn't entirely a compliment. She wasn't becoming a harsher person. She was becoming a complete one, reclaiming a discarded piece of herself that the old family system had simply never had room for. This is precisely the friction Jung meant when he described the shadow's return as disruptive to the very relationships it's meant to eventually deepen. The people who loved your incomplete self will often, at first, mistake your completion for a loss. Part 5, The Return Here, is where Jung's model diverges completely from the popular idea of self-discovery as a permanent exit from other people. Individuation, in his writing, was never meant to end in a cave. The person who completes this arc doesn't return to the group by becoming small again. They return as something the group didn't have before, a person who survived being unmirrored and came back with an offering rather than a request. There is a specific and recognizable shift that marks this final stage. Early in the process, almost everyone is asking, quietly, "Will you accept me?" By the end of a genuine individuation arc, the question flips. Without anyone announcing it, "Here is what I built while you couldn't see me, would you like it?" The first question begs. The second question offers. And offerings, unlike begging, don't require anyone's permission to have value. Consider once more our retired teacher from Part 1. 18 months after the disorienting quiet of her kitchen mornings, she began mentoring 2 younger women, navigating their own early retirements, not because a program assigned her to do it, but because she had, in Jung's language, integrated something in the isolation that she now had to give away. She hadn't returned to her old identity as an educator. She had built a new one, on the other side of a silence that once felt like punishment. This is the return Jung actually described. Not a rescue from loneliness by other people, but a homecoming you build yourself, which other people are then welcome to visit. It's worth being precise about what this return does and doesn't look like, because it's easy to romanticize. It rarely arrives as a single dramatic moment. More often it shows up as a series of small, almost unremarkable decisions. Choosing to speak a genuine opinion at a family dinner instead of the agreeable one you've given for 30 years. Choosing to end a friendship that only ever wanted the old, smaller version of you. Choosing to start something, a class, a craft, a small project, for no reason other than that it finally feels like yours. None of these moments will look, from the outside, like the culmination of a Jungian psychological process. They will just look like an ordinary Tuesday, but each one is a small repayment on everything the furnace asked of you. And here's the part Jung insisted on, again and again, against every tempting shortcut. This process cannot be borrowed from a book, a video, or another person's account of their own individuation, including this one. It can only be lived, at your own pace, through your own specific losses, and your own specific silences. What a video like this can offer is not the process itself, but a map proof that the disorientation has a shape, that other people have walked through it before you, and that the emptiness currently sitting in your chest is not a verdict on your life. It is an invitation to a life that hasn't been built yet. Here's the final reframe, and it's worth sitting with longer than the 30 seconds it takes to hear it. Belonging that requires you to stay small was never real belonging. It was rental space in someone else's identity. What Jung mapped, across an entire career, was the far harder and far more permanent alternative, the kind of belonging you can only reach after you've proven, to yourself, that you can survive without it. So if the room feels emptier lately, if old conversations don't land the way they used to, if certain invitations